Thank you for your time. I appreciate you being here. Please keep in mind what we are doing here on Bet on It and Food for Thought and Shooting from the Hip. We explore human ideas, philosophies, noteworthy information. This exploration is us thinking aloud, a thought exercise, jumping into ideas and examining and re-examining them. You will find we're prone to using adult language and expressing opinions. In keeping with that, you shouldn't believe anything we say. We are not experts of any kind. We're just having fun with these ideas, philosophies, and information, in the hopes that you will find it fun and entertaining. We encourage you to invest time in searching out these subjects and come to your own conclusions. Now, on with the shit show. You know who I am? I'm Betula. Slim, what goes, buddy?
I gained 35 pounds. Now I'm not slim anymore.
Fat bastards. Oh, sorry, is that politically incorrect? Oh, my bad.
I'll ask Mike Myers.
What are you going to ask Mike Myers?
No.
Getting on with today's episode. So today's episode, we're going to be discussing the aquatic ape theory, our hypothesis rather. We're going to talk about sea nomads, the Sama Bajau, the orang Laut, and the Moken, and sponge divers, the let me try that again. Haenyo. Okay, so you're probably wondering, like, well, why? So I don't know if you recall, but on one previous past episode, we got into the discussion where we were talking about that I felt that there was a confusion, that people often cite human behavior for our nature. And I made the argument that our nature is actually something completely separate from behavior. They do overlap because our behavior is a result of our nature, but our nature is this thing that can be informed and then influences our behavior. But your nature are those innate qualities that exist in humans. So I'm just going to briefly go over them really quickly, and then I'm going to demonstrate why the sea nomads and the aquatic ape hypothesis, why that's even relevant. So very quickly, human nature, as I see it, can be summed up in 6 categories. 1, it's in our nature to be intelligent. It's also in our nature to be curious. It's also in our nature to be creative. It's also in our nature to be adaptive. So number 4, adaptive, or rather adaptability, is what will overlap with the topic of conversation. And 5 and 6 are emotional and sexual. Those are the things that constitute the nature of what it is to be human. So every human exhibits them. It's innate qualities, and those are the qualities that all our behaviors kind of stem from, as they're influenced by, like, social conditioning, culture, and everything else that influences your prejudices, bias, or preferences, right? So, but at the root of all of that, or at the root of everyone, are those common traits, right? So, why we're focusing on adaptability? It's to demonstrate. We're going to demonstrate that it's a real effect. That's why we're going to talk about the aquatic ape hypothesis and the sea nomads and the haenyo. It's Japanese, right? So anyway, we'll get into it. So starting with the aquatic ape hypothesis, or otherwise known as the aquatic ape theory, or the Waterside hypothesis of human evolution. So what it postulates is that the ancestors of modern humans took a divergent evolutionary path from those of the great apes by becoming adapted to a more aquatic environment, right? So, and why do they argue this? The hypothesis was initially proposed by an English marine biologist Alister Hardy in 1960, who argued that a branch of apes was forced by competition over terrestrial habitats to hunt for food such as shellfish on the seashore and seabed, so that in water that you could wade into, right, which would you know, where you would probably find an abundance of sea life just within, you know, water that's like, say, less than 6 feet deep, or say 4 or 5 feet. So we know that, like, you know, like fish and crustaceans, they're also in abundance in those shallow waters. So it's, as again, even though it's just a hypothesis, it's not too unreasonable in terms of the way that it's approaching its idea, right? So in doing this, it led to adaptations that explain distinctive characteristics of modern humans, such as functional hairlessness and bipedalism, like, you know, like, that it may have contributed to our ability to do that, so that we became more bipedal because the water displaced our weight, so mobility was easier in water, so become more acclimated with using your legs, and then using your hands for grasping more specifically, right? And then the actual direction that their hair follicles go in, like that, they make us more streamlined, as though we were designed to be moved from the medium water. I'm not saying that this is 100% accurate. I'm just saying that this is what was proposed. People did give this a moment of seriousness, so it's just something I thought worthy of sharing. So, you got any comment you'd like to include, or?
No, I think it's interesting that we definitely have a lot of species that evolved near water. It's not too crazy to think that we might have had some adaptations to playing around in water, gathering.
Well, considering that whales are mammals, it's, again, I don't know, is it really that much of a stretch to imagine a life form, say something as complicated as like humans, because we do it, we live on coastlines, right? And it's because it's easy to harvest, the resources from the sea, and you don't have to venture that far out, although we do that too. But you could do it, so for very, say, simple hunter-gatherer cultures, it might be a habitat that's really conducive to thriving, right? And if you're forced off out of more traditional habitats, where the environment's like, you know, you have to assert dominance to have access to whatever available resources there are. This becomes this perfect alternative, and then it might have again fostered that kind of the ability to, because you start by, you know, reducing buoyancy, you're not moving through air, so there's more stability in standing in the water, say for an early hominid. So again, it's not unreasoned thinking. But having said that, we'll get on to another supporter of the hypothesis, Elaine Morgan, and in her 1972 book, The Descent of Women, she and then in detail in her 1990 book, Scars of Evolution, she received favorable reviews writing about the aquatic ape theory, but it was subject to criticism from anthropologist John Langdon in 1997, and criticized it as an umbrella hypothesis. So even though that they're like, as an idea in and of itself, there might have been some merit to it, but there was certainly no evidence for it, right? Like, and I think that other anthropologists too kind of saw it as sort of like a convenient kind of way to try and explain stuff, but might not have been an accurate reflection of what had actually occurring. And they cite that there was inconsistencies that were unresolved, and a claim to validation via principle of parsimony. So parsimony is where an extreme unwillingness to use resources, so to not vet out what they're thinking, just because they're essentially that the mistake that the people who are proposing this, they weren't willing to do the work to find evidence to support what they were saying. So they're just sort of saying, like, it's reasonable just to think that, and that therefore that might be some legitimacy. But unfortunately, we do require more than just even a good idea. You need something more. You need something substantial to support any idea. No idea is worth itself on its own, other than to maybe be used as a thought exercise. It gets value when you can substantiate it with some kind of empirical evidence of one kind or another to support it. So would you agree with that?
Yeah, even the scientific method, you have to have the hypothesis. It's not a strict belief, but it's a if-then scenario, and then it also includes the because. Like, whatever is evident will become evident eventually.
Right.
It's not like you can go in just saying, okay, this is reasonable enough, but you have no evidence.
Right, and then reproducibility, or the fact that like anyone should be able to look into it in the way that you have and come to the same conclusion. That's what reproducibility allows for, and refutability, the ability to actually refute it. Like, so all those things are important parts of the scientific method, which is not exclusive to scientists. It's just a way to investigate things, to try to determine as best as possible, or within our limited abilities, what's the most likely, what's most likely is actually occurring, right? So it's that's fair. So it would be fair to say that the hypothesis is highly controversial and has been criticized by many as pseudoscience. It's, to be fair, and again, no real work's done it, but I always found it a super fascinating kind of theory, because for somebody like myself, the idea that maybe we shared a common ancestry, like, or somehow we're connected to whales in a more profound way, I found kind of appealing, like in mammals, aquatic mammals and stuff. And as much as I love to swim and splash around in water, so so it's always something of interest, right? So the Nature editor and paleontologist Henry G. has argued that the hypothesis has equivalent merit to creationism and should be similarly dismissed, right?
Oh.
So like I said, to say that like they don't treat it with a lot of credibility, is, that's kind of evident, right? Like,
yeah, it's really awful to hear, considering like both sides.
Well, but just because it's a reasonable idea doesn't necessarily mean that it's true.
Right.
But it doesn't mean it should be dismissed out of hand either.
Exactly. Like if you're saying, oh, it's right up there with creationism, it's like, okay, well, it seems
well,
like
because but in the defense of creationism, it's faith-based, so they don't need evidence. But these are people who are asserting or making claims without evidence, who are supposed to be like professionals, and it's like, well, that's kind of an enormous shortfall, right?
Was there any evidence to support the idea? Like,
well, it's interesting that you ask. In 1942, the German pathologist, Max Westenhofer, he'd argued that various human characteristics like hairlessness, subcutaneous fat, and the regression of the olfactory organ, webbed fingers, and direction of the body hair, our body hair, might argue in support of the fact that there's an aquatic primate in our past, right? Or an aquatic hominid that we're maybe more tightly connected to because of these characteristics. Right now, subcutaneous fat, that's the fat that lies below the musculature, so that would encapsulate organs. Why is that important? It would protect the organs from the cold of the water, right? So, and then our general hairlessness, although some of us are more hairy than others. That could be so he argued it could be derived from our aquatic past, quoting several other authors who have made similar speculations, as he did not believe human beings were apes. He believed that this might have been during the Cretaceous. Contrary to what is possible, given the geological and evolutionary biological evidence available at the time. So the idea in and of itself is not that new, but many don't take it all that seriously, right? Because again, as far as human origins go, which is an enormously complicated subject that has a lot of competing ideas and not a lot of evidence. Lots of ideas, but again, it constitutes it's fair to say, a real mystery. But to me, I'm fond of the idea that somehow there might be something to it. Now, of course, I don't subscribe to any one idea. I always ask for evidence, right? So there's no evidence, at least beyond superficial evidence, like arguing based on our the way our bodies are structured, that somehow that might support that position. So I don't, like I said, to me it's just, I think it's just noteworthy, but that's it, right?
Yeah, in these spaces it's fun to have different interpretations, but I feel like this holds some ground, at least if you think about, at least, well, I was going to say our change in diet over thousands and thousands of years, it wouldn't be too crazy to think that somewhere in there we found an ability to
it's not
water.
It's not entirely unreasonable. The failing is that it is that there's no evidence for it, right? So and that those who proposed it weren't willing to go that extra distance to that end, right? So so having said that, I think that kind of sums up the totality of the aquatic ape hypothesis. Although, like I said, it's just an interesting idea, and if nothing else, just I'm open to ideas. So it's one that's just noteworthy. Now, having said that, we can move on to Asia's sea nomads. So you're probably wondering, what the hell's he talking about? Who are the sea nomads? Well, there are three groups of them, and in total number, they number about 1 million people across Asia, and they're referred to as the sea nomads, right? Because they're essentially hunter-gatherers who just basically live out in the open water, right? Now, again, they'll live in the waters where there's an abundance of sea life to support their life, so that it's conducive to them being able to survive. But essentially, they're hunter-gatherers, right? And they just live on boats. Now, what makes just for the sake of identifying each of the three groups, one of them is referred to as a Sama Bajau, and the second group is the Laut, and the third group is the Moken. And so they're distinct groups because they inhabit distinct regions in the South Pacific, across I guess it would be the South China Sea, right? So it's in that region. It's just that's an enormous region. So they're independent of each other, but they're essentially people who are doing the same thing. So they live along the coast and off the islands of Southeast Asia, and their populations have lived as marine nomadic lifestyle for thousands of years. So this isn't recent. They've been doing this for at least the last 2,000 years. So that alone, again, is super interesting fact. The fact that they, you have these individuals who are leading we live in this high-tech world where everything's interconnected and internet, and then here you go, you have these marine sea nomads, right? I think to me, I love the idea that, that there's people completely disconnected with the internet and computers, and they live on boats most of their lives. It's fascinating.
Yeah, directly connected to their environment.
And completely dependent on it as well, right? So, okay, so we'll just start with the first group, the Sama Bajau. I hope I'm saying that correctly. I'm assuming that's the correct pronunciation. They're people who live across the southern Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. The rough estimates, again, the sources I got stated there was about 1 million of them. Now, the way I interpret it is that is in all three groups. Between all three groups, right? Because essentially it's the same. It's a pretty big ocean, the South China Sea, right? Or it's part of the Pacific, so that region's enormous. So it can probably easily accommodate multiple groups. So, and like I said, they've been living on houseboats and traveling from place to place in the waters of Southeast Asia and visiting land only occasionally. Like, so that's to get like things like gas for engines. So initially, when they first started living that sea nomad lifestyle, they were probably doing it in dugouts and boats, and with oars and wind driven. And now today they use gas propelled, but they're still essentially hunter gatherers. Like they harvest everything they need from the ocean itself, right? So it's super fascinating, right? And most of their food directly comes from the ocean. Their diet consists of many kinds of fish, sea urchins, and octopi. So they like calamari. Which are caught largely, and here's the thing, so largely the way that they do catch them isn't always been in the same traditional way, spear fishing, gathering them at low tide and those tide pools. Like, so when the tide goes out, they might get trapped in them, so you can just easily pull them out, and using nets, right? This is how I'm gonna dovetail it or overlap it with what we were talking about, human nature, and specifically number 4, adaptability. They're able to hold their breaths for highly unusual times, right? And so the highly trained divers and population can stay underwater for as long as 13 minutes and dive to depths of about 200 feet. On average, they're able to hold their breath underwater for from 3 to 5 minutes. That's the average, because they spend so much time in the water. So just as a result of spending like all that time in that environment, unintentionally they've created this ability to do that. And we know that when you have a higher tolerance for CO2, so holding your breath for a couple minutes, it makes much more oxygen available, or it's in your bloodstream, and they're trapped in. Trap's not the right word. That the red blood cells are holding onto. It suddenly makes all of that available for the body to use. So on average, these people are like doing 3 to 5 minutes, and the best of them are upwards of like 13 minutes. Right? We are going to one day, I promise, we're going to study, we're going to come back to this subject in a more intensive way. We're going to talk about the limitations of the human body, but that's not for today. But to just keep that in mind, it'll make for a super fascinating episode. And what's most interesting is that in the Samu Bajau, they run a wide range of like faith systems. So for them, some of them are strict adherents to Sunni Islam and forms of folk Islam, which is like the Sufi Islam, which is like the more mystical side of Islam, and animist beliefs in spirits and ancestor worship. So again, they make for this super interesting group of people. So I'm fascinated by the idea that, how they're able to hold their breaths and do breath retention. And again, it speaks to everything that I love about meditation and breath work, right? So anything you'd like to share?
13 minutes just seems unrealistic, like crazy amount of time.
Well, I think the world record is like 26 minutes.
Well, that's, again, like, that's insane. But if this is something that's going on daily for these people,
can you imagine? Every day.
Yeah. How can somebody sit in a chair, just relax, and hold their breath for 40 seconds or a minute? Yeah, they can do it for 20 minutes.
Well, and I think that it does. It really demonstrates this idea that we are adaptive, and that if you provide a beneficial stimuli, it produces a very specific outcome. So breath work, meditation, are methods of training. They're tools. It's not something to be treated as like some form of mysticism or magic or anything like that. All you're doing is providing a very specific type of stimuli that produces a very specific outcome in the person, right? And that specific outcome allows for them to suddenly demonstrate like a capacity that some people would describe as superhuman. You go, it's not. It's the limits of a well-trained human. We were talking about this off camera before you brought up David Goggins. Now, for those of you who are listening who don't know who David Goggins is, he's a motivational speaker, but his particular area of specialty is he's an ultra marathonist, and in terms of and a sport of physical exercise, but like as far as that goes, he's extreme in everything that he does. But again, for him, it's always about pushing the limits of what is considered doable physically, right? So, and again, I promise to cover that more when we get, because we are going to do an episode based on like the physically how far and what the physical limits of the human body are and what it's really capable of. But I digress. Let's get back to the sea nomad. So having said that about the Samu Bajau, we're going to move on to the Orang Laut, because each of these different groups, they're slightly different, and they functionally do different things. Like Orang Laut is a Malay term that literally means sea people, and there's several seafaring ethnic groups, tribes living around Singapore, Peninsular Malaysia, and the Indonesian Riau Islands. Okay, they spend most of their time on the water, and they're natives of Singapore, so they establish themselves in the region, and they acting as middlemen, navigators, and hired guns. So these are people who are serve more practical functions in terms of like seaports and that sort of thing. They work as liaisons from the port officials or whoever's in charge of that, and incoming vessels and that sort of thing, right? So and it's because they spend so much of their time on the open water. They patrol the adjacent sea areas, and they repel real pirates, and they direct traders to their employers' ports and maintain those ports' dominance in the area, right? So they serve a very practical function, unlike the Sama Bajau are more like they're real sea nomads, whereas the Orang Laut, they have a much more mainstream function, and they're just people super comfortable being on the water all the time, right? So, but they're land-based people, like Singapore and that. Okay, so, and then we'll move on to the Moken, also known as the Moken or Morgan. And again, another translation literally suggests that they're sea people. Now, this group is small. So there's about 2,000 to 3,000 of them, and they live semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle, heavily based on the sea. So much like the Sama Bajau, but the Sama Bajau are enormous in their number, right? So they can be found in the Mirugai Archipelago, a group of approximately 800 islands claimed both by Myanmar and Thailand, right? So knowledge of the sea enables them to live off of its fauna and flora by using simple tools such as nets and spears to forage for food. And their method of like harvesting the resources from the oceans, it has a minimal impact on the environment, and even though it's an intensive form of subsistence, it almost has a minimal impact on the ecology of the oceans that they live in, right? So it's well within what the resources can sustain, so they don't tax the resources. So the Moken believe strongly in natural or that everything belongs to the community, that nothing can belong to any one person. So they have that real nomad kind of philosophy with regards to like individual rights over the natural resources that they use, right? So, and their society is quite egalitarian, and again, they do ancestral worship and presenting supernatural beings with food offerings. So they have no real religion per se, and it's more like they revere their ancestry, right? So again, it makes for super interesting stuff. So getting back to, again, these people clearly demonstrate what we're talking about, adaptability as being part of being an example of human nature. So they're a perfect example of people being adapted to living on and working underwater. They also represent evidence that humans can genetically adapt to diving by being identified for the first time in a new study. So what ended up happening was researchers ended up like spending time with and collecting evidence on the Bajau, and they were discovered to have genetically enlarged spleens, right, which enable them to free dive to depths up to 70 meters, which is about 200 feet, right, at 200 feet of water. So it's that pressure, because once you get to 200 feet, it's a lot of water pressure on the body. So the spleen works in some capacity to be able to provide oxygen. I don't pretend to understand the science of it. I just know that that's the role that it takes in the diving, right? They are uniquely adapted, and they to a degree so anyone who spends now think about that, we're aware for at least a couple thousand years that they've been living out in the open water, and then within that short period of time they've adapted to, at least physiologically, genetically, it favors larger spleens. So the best divers among them probably have considerably larger spleens, right? So, and researchers were fascinated, like from around the globe, by the fact that these people were doing this, right? So, especially because they're like, again, their best divers could consistently, on average, hit about 13 minutes underwater. So you can imagine that, just hanging out in your bathtub underwater for 13 minutes. And they're moving around because they're doing hunter-gatherer stuff. They're just not sitting there, right? So it's super fascinating. So in 1999, Anne Gisland of the University of Lund in Sweden was investigating different aspects of vision. Okay, so here another interesting thing with regards to adaptation. It turned out that Moken children were able to see twice as well as European children who performed the same experiment. So they did the same experiment on the average North European child and the Moken children, and they had better vision. So the question became more like, what's going on? To see clearly above land, you need to be able to reflect light that enters the eye into the retina. The retina sits at the back of the eye and contains specialized cells which convert light signals into electrical signals that the brain interprets as images, right? So Gisland figured that in order for the Moken children to see clearly underwater, they must have either picked up some adaptation that fundamentally changed the way their eyes work, or they had learned to use their eyes differently underwater. And so what we'll end up discovering is that it's actually a bit of both, right? So had to be some kind of like a manipulation of the eye itself. So there's two ways in which you can theoretically improve your vision underwater. You can change the shape of the lens, which is called accommodation, or you can make the pupil smaller, thereby decreasing the depth of field, right? So their pupil size was easy to measure and revealed that they can constrict their pupils to the maximum known limit of human performance, so that, in squinting, like once they got in water, like you could squint in such a way that it would have this effect, that it would produce, like, that it would narrow we were talking about the iris, so that it would make it better suited for seeing in water. The Moken children are able to do both. They can make their pupil smaller and change the lens shape. So by squinting, it changes the shape of the lens to reflect the light under the water, so they can see better. It's a similar adaptation that seals and dolphins have. That they're able to do that with their eyes, right? To make so that their eyes are better suited in those environments. So it's kind of interesting. Here you go, humans adapting to their environment. I think when we talked about it in the episode previously, where we did talk about human nature, we did cite, I cited that the Inuit were an interesting example of like people perfectly suited to living in a really cold environment, and that their physical stature reflected that, because it allowed for better conservation of energy, so that shorter limbs and their trunks were thicker, and it was all for the purposes of like retaining body heat, right? So again, super interesting to see this happening, and this is over and above the fact that they can hold their breath and dive to these unusual. Can you imagine free diving to 230 feet? That's about 70 meters, right? So
I can't imagine myself doing it. I can imagine someone else.
Yeah, so it like I said, I find it kind of like just crazy that here we go, real world examples every day. They're not a thing of the past. They exist today.
And that's a relatively quick adaptation.
Yeah, it makes you wonder then how quickly do we as humans respond to new environments. So if the demand is there, does your physiology respond then to kind of meet the demand, right? Because I'm sure it would be difficult for, say, anybody from, say, here in North America to go and live among them, but I would be confident if they could spend a year, that you might be surprised by what suddenly this person could and could not do in terms of like breath retention and their capacity to do things underwater. I think you might find it would be kind of amazing, really, right? So it's an intriguing idea. So now having said that, I want to cover another interesting example of human adaptation, and it's Haenyoi, Hangal, literally sea women. They're the female divers off the Korean province of Jeju, whose livelihood consists of harvesting a variety of mollusks, seaweed, and other sea life from the ocean. Known for their independent spirit, iron will, and determination, the Haenyeo are representative of the semi-matriarchal family structures of Jeju. So it was something that was brought to the Korean peninsula from Japan, because they have sponge divers, right? So again, it's people who they're in an environment where there's a rich number of resources, and then the best way to harvest or access the resources is to physically go after them yourself. So so that means that you end up becoming a real a practical, functional a diver, right? But like a free diver, somebody who, without the benefit of equipment and stuff, is able to, and they're diving. So they were diving up to 30 meters, about 100 feet, and they can hold their breaths consistently for about, the range is like 3 to 5 minutes, right? And the tradition goes back to 434 BCE, before the Common Era, right? So they've been doing it for thousands of years, like harvesting resources from the ocean depths. Now, originally, it was exclusively a male-dominated profession, and with the exception of the women who'd work alongside their husbands. But then, as time progressed, women started more predominantly become, this particular profession of divers. It was women started dominating the field, right? So, and believe it or not, they do offer up, there are several explanations for why this shift occurred, and significant. So let me try that again. In the 17th century, a significant number of men died at sea or due to war or deep sea fishing accidents, meaning that the diving work was still available and required workers. So then the women had to answer that call. And then physiologically speaking, women have more subcutaneous fat. It's not a shot against women, and a higher this I didn't know, and a higher shivering threshold than men, and better equipped to withstand the cold of the waters. So many of these women ended up becoming the primary laborers for their families because of again, they're just better suited to spending. Can you imagine spending all day in the cold water like that? Right? Not me, man.
Yeah, pretty much.
So and the Japanese brought that free diving kind of, like I said, they introduced it into Korea, on the coastal of Korea, because of, again, it was just this effective way to be able to harvest resources, and they created a professional living as a result of doing it. They were able to, like economically, it empowered those people, because a lot of the stuff that they brought up from the seafloor was suddenly they're being paid richly for, right? So they were benefiting from suddenly being able to, press the limits of what they physically could do, and it produced economic livelihood for their family. So it's again, super interesting thing. I think I find it fascinating that here you go, within the real world, something that most of us are completely oblivious to, and yet there's examples of like people who on average are able to do things that we would go, oh, it's impossible. It's only for those hyper specialized. And I think it illustrates the point that any human's capable of anything. So sometimes necessity drives it, and sometimes you can be driven to it just for the sheer just curiosity, just to see if you can or can't do it, to do a thing. So I think the idea is like stands alone to support the idea that as human beings we are adaptive, and this demonstrates it clearly in an interesting way, like in terms of the free diving, although there's other examples of that stuff. But this shows that even the average person could learn to be able to hold their breath for like 3 to 4 minutes, as long as 5 minutes underwater, if the right stimuli was there, and the necessity for them to be able to do it was a part of their day-to-day experience, and their body would meet that demand or meet that need. They would adapt, right?
Yeah, so it's awesome how when it comes to adaptability, like there's so many niches we could be a part of. Like I don't want to say we're specialized animals, and I don't want to say we're generalized animals, but we seem well suited to figuring things out.
Or a generalized animal that could become a specialized animal?
Yeah.
Because we're so generalized?
No, I don't think it's contradictory.
No, I don't think so either. I think what it just means that we have the capacity to really to become exceptionally specialized and adaptive to something very specific, and then still broad enough that it doesn't preclude us from being able to do other things, right? Or to expand in other capacities.
Oh yeah, oftentimes there's transferable skills.
Yeah, for sure, I would completely agree. Again, it's because I'm somebody who likes to frolic in the water. You can imagine me frolicking in the water. Because oh my God. Sorry, Sorry about that. For those of you watching, real life accident. Too bad we weren't swimming in water. Is it good?
The wire's turning. It's still.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay.
So you're frolicking.
Oh, okay, were we frolicking? I can't even remember. That was completely unexpected. What a lively way to change the conversation, or to liven up the conversation. Oh, we were talking about being generalists allows for us the capacity to become hyper specialized in anything without losing the ability to be more generalized. So again, it speaks to this idea that as far as human nature goes, we are adaptive. We do not only adapt to the environment that we find ourselves in, but we can also go out of our way to create those adaptations intentionally. So when you're adapting to the environment, it's practical because you're in that environment, and it's not real. I don't want to say it's like driven by intention, but it is kind of, because you're just responding to the stimuli of the environment, and then your body adapts to it. But free divers willfully go to their way with the intent to be able to produce that same effect, but without the practicalness. They're just trying to see how long they can hold their breath underwater, which again, you are kind of astounding. And so that makes you wonder then, what can the average person do? Probably, I don't know, I dare say I wouldn't go so far as to say is that they could produce that, but they might. And I think, if anything, they might surprise themselves what they're capable of if they just simply apply themselves. So something I often say on camera when we talk about it is that sometimes it's just a matter of showing up. Right? Just show up, keep doing what you need to do, and if you're consistent, it produces a very specific outcome, right? So it's interesting. Here we go. Here's another example of why humans are capable of way more than we ever give ourselves credit for. So that means you, the person that's watching this, I'm not suggesting that you go out and learn how to hold your breath, but that you could certainly have the capacity to grow beyond whatever limitations that you perceive that are preventing you from being able to do things.
Yeah, I want to add, I really like those, I'm not sure if actually this last one was part of it, but being creative, being adaptive, and then also, like, when I say creative, I mean, like, your reaction to stimuli is creative, you can orient it, like, that's the intelligence part. Seems like all of these skills perfectly, they work together to make us holistic.
Well, okay, so again, this conversation is really about human nature. So, and to be clear, like, just to reiterate, what I assume is human nature, which I argue is not our behavior, because people often cite the way people behave as human nature. They immediately write, oh, that's just human nature. I'm like, I don't think so. I think human nature are these 6 characteristics. 1, we're intelligent. 2, we're curious, so investigative, just naturally, and we're inherently like that. 3, we're creative, right? So that curiosity and creativity go hand in hand with the intelligence. And then 4, we're adaptive. That you can you apply enough pressure gradually to any one human, you can radically transform them into something that they're currently not.
Look at any sport we have out there.
It's proof of it, right?
Yeah.
And then 5, of course, we recognize that we're all emotional, and 6, sexual. I think that does drive, emotion and once we reach puberty, I think then sexuality has a huge impact on us as well. So, and think about how many people suffer from anxiety and hang-ups with regards to their sexuality because of their emotions, right? So these are the things that are at work within each and every one of us. Probably explains why, for so many of us, we have such common experiences. The fine details are different, but in terms of the gross experience, we tend to suffer in the same ways and suffer over the same things. Yes. Yeah. Agree, disagree?
I would say we can emotionally relate to each other a lot.
Yeah, because we all experience like emotions, and we all.
It's usually like similar, kind of sad or.
Well, it's just the full range. We know what joy feels like.
Oh yeah, no, right? I love that stuff.
Yeah, but even sexuality, like the benefits of that we all. It's because it's a common part of who we all are. We all have that experience, and again, the experiences themselves are by and large the same for most of us. It's just the fine details that get kind of where there's kind of variability, but it's the thing that it'll either motivate us or act to be an impediment. But all these things that I've cited as human nature all work in that way. They're double-edged swords. that so they can work to your benefit and they can work against you. So the argument I always make is that you can refine them. You can apply stressors, like we've discussed about the sea nomads. For them, it was environmental stressors or stimuli, however you'd like to say it, and it produced a very specific effect in them. So now they're perfectly suited for their environments, and then as a result of that, they had these natural enhancements, right? So I'm like, if that's true, just based on them adapting to environment, then those of us living in any climate, anywhere, that we can artificially choose stimuli that will elicit and produce very specific adaptations in us that can enhance the quality of our existence, that can make us more realized and more fully actualized human beings by providing stimuli. So you get here, we can choose, especially if you live in like a first world countries where you have the access to disciplines and modalities to be able to do that. That's what this stuff illustrates, right? That the sea nomads, the Hanayoi, they all represent what we could all do without actually having to fit those roles that they fit. Like, because for them, it's very practical. It serves, the needs for the basic needs. That's how they access their basic needs. We can have the benefit of what that stimuli can do to you in terms of like pushing the boundaries of what you are as a human being. We can introduce it artificially into our lives as a training method to produce that very specific effects and to make us more, again, like I said, more fully realized, more actualized human beings. So things like breath work and meditation, it speaks to the benefit. All you have to do is just keep showing up, and given enough time, it'll produce that very specific outcome, right? That's the whole premise of exercise.
Yeah, I was going to say, it doesn't have to be a long-standing cultural thing. You just go for a walk after a month, or go for multiple walks over the span of a month.
But if
there's a difference,
right? But if you're gonna do walking, then you want to find something that's going to make it challenging and engaging, so that again, that's like
it's like creatively adapting stressors to your benefit.
Right, and then the beauty is you get to choose them. So you find ones that appeal to you, that work within your sensibilities, that appeal to you, and then you actively pursue those. And then in the pursuit of those, like, hopefully it leads to others, like because that's the thing about any kind of training, especially when it's a physical kind of conditioning. It may lead to other methods of training. It might just because you're following that particular method exposes you to other ideas, which again might fall in line with your sensibilities, and then suddenly, before you know it, now you're getting more involved in other activities that produce even greater physical changes and outcomes. And no physical change is purely physical. Like, there's a mental component to all of it. Any kind of physical activity, any kind, is 90% mental and 10% physical. Even though we experience it like through the body, through that 10%, the ability to be able to do anything in that 10% and then to push those physical limitations is a direct result of the mind, which is, it's all mental. It's 90%. So you kill it or you arise to the occasion because of that 90%. So it's all about mental acuity and focus. So you bring that to the table, then you're physically able to do almost anything, right?
Over time.
Like right. It's all over time, right? Because the idea is that you got to give it enough time so that the body and our systems can adequately adapt to it.
Yeah, like we can't just spend the next 5 minutes not breathing and be okay.
Yeah.
Gradual.
Yeah, there are consequences, right? So, but if you gradually work up to that, then you could, without any negative consequence.
Even if the upper limits aren't even close to like 3 minutes, it's still extremely impressive to go, hey, I could go without breathing for 2 whole minutes.
Yeah, but again, you're not doing it as an accolade. You're doing it because there's a whole host of like physiological and psychological benefits that come from doing it, right? That's the other thing.
I'm not sure why one person would want to just be able to hold their breath. Maybe they have a good reason for it.
Again, it's because of the physiological and psychological benefits. But if you turn it into bragging rights, it gets you're getting into weird stuff. Where you're making it about ego, right?
Yeah. Oh, I can hold my breath for 2 minutes. Really? Wow. Do it for longer, please. But it's interesting because it's not like you just get to avoid breathing air. Like that seems almost inconsequential.
Well, because we take it for granted because we do it all the time. So we just presume that somehow that we just are doing it correctly. Well,
there's other benefits to breath work too. It's not just like the breathing.
Right. So if anyone who's watching this, if you will watch the episode where we covered breath work and meditation, there's some very interesting details with regards to which I don't want to go over them again in this, although it might be worth mentioning. But the benefits of it in terms of like what it does potentially do for you. In terms of like the function of breathing, like something that we all take for granted. There is considered a biologically correct way to breathe, and a rate, and that includes rate and speed and that sort of thing, which most of us, we don't ever give any time or consideration to those things, wondering like, well, if you do them in the most efficient way possible, it produces a very specific physiological response that's extremely healthy. That's the reason why you would do it. It produces the best health outcomes, right? And the least of which is introducing like nitric oxide consistently into the bloodstream, because if you nasally breathe, it causes the mechanics of nasally breathing causes the sinus the lining of the sinus cavities to release nitric oxide into our lungs, and nitrous oxide is a natural antiviral, antibacterial, antimicrobial agent that your body naturally manufactures or produces and releases, but it only releases it through the mechanical action of nasal breathing. So again, to clarify, nasal breathing in and out through the nose only, right? So again, super fascinating stuff, right? That you would think could impact the way people conduct themselves and live their lives. But as I said, most people, they don't give it the time, any time of day, never mind the time of day, right? So speaking of time, can we get a time check?
We're 57 minutes in.
Okay, I think that might kind of sum up this episode. Is there any kind of questions you might have? Any comments you'd like to make?
For comments, I would say please refer to other videos that seem related to this topic. You might enjoy them too.
I agree. Certainly don't agree with that. I think what you're going to find is that ultimately what we're talking about here on the channel is because this is all of it an exploration of what it means to be human, and here beyond like all the physical adaptations to living in a water environment, it shows, it illustrates that the humanity's comes in so many different packages and different shapes and forms. It's kind of fascinating that we present in so many different ways, and I think it's kind of endearing. It makes us all the more interesting. So having said that, I think I'd like to just sum up then, and I'll just remind everyone that I'd like to thank you for your time, but more than anything, I would like for you to question everything, and you may consider starting with questioning yourself first. Seek balance, seek knowledge, seek understanding. Become a renegade, individualist, humanist, critical, objective thinker. Thank you for your time. Love you all. Good night.